Hello and welcome to the stream. My name is bradgarropy. I'm a front-end developer at Adobe. And today I'm going to give a little talk on React hooks and context as a state management solution. And personally, something that I like to use instead of Redux. So let's get started. This presentation does assume that you have definitely a bit of knowledge about React, as well as a bit of knowledge about React hooks. No Redux knowledge is needed, as I'm not going to be giving a direct comparison, but instead offering up my solution for context and hooks as state management. Hopefully you'll like the patterns that I present and adopt it. First, I'm going to start with a little about me. I graduated from the University of Texas with an electrical engineering degree. After that, I worked at Dell for 9 years and taught myself web development over the course of the past 2 to 3 years, and then landed a job at Adobe. I've got a wife and 2 kids, as well as a dog, and my hobbies include bodybuilding, live streaming like you're seeing here, and country music. Love going to concerts, love dancing. So let's start off with what is context. First off, context is part of React's API. You don't have to install another package. It comes bundled with React right out of the gate. Context provides to provide that state to multiple components in your component tree. And like I mentioned, provider, context works on a provider-consumer model where you define a single context provider that wraps the components that will consume it. And then inside those components, you can define a consumer, which it's like sucking the context state into your component out of thin air, and then you can use it. So like this example over here on the right. You've got a user context in this case. Say your application's very large here, is your context state. You can put anything in here, functions, variables, whatever you want. And this is the state that can get sucked into any component that this provider wraps. So you can think of this as wrapping your entire application or a subtree of your application, whatever you like. And then if you come down here and look at the avatar component, you pull context in by using the React hook called useContext and passing in the context. And out of it, you get the value. And in this case, I destructured name and pulled that out of the state object. And then you can use it in the component. One thing that's also cool here is that you can have multiple contexts. So you can logically split up your application state into different sections. For instance, maybe you might have a user context or a shopping cart context or a toast notification context. And these can all exist separately and wrap different subtrees of your application. Definitely cool. So I'm going to talk about the reasons why I like context and then go through a little demo to help you understand and implement the context plus hooks state pattern. One, I think it's very ergonomic. To me, it has a simple mental model. Context is just functions, especially when using it with hooks. The useContext hook is just a function that you call that returns an object, the context, the state that you want to share. And again, the fact that it takes advantage of hooks is great. The older context API used render props, which I found difficult to use and understand. And second, it's very functional. You can have multiple state stores and split them up logically and only share them with the components that need them. And another benefit here is that you're keeping your state close to the consumers. Like you wouldn't want to put, let's say you had a context for a product page and it contained all the details of your product, you wouldn't want to have to wrap your entire application with a global state object that contained the product. No, because the only part of your app that cares about that is your product component. So what this allows you to do is only wrap a subtree of your application with context. And if your state gets pretty hairy, or let's say you do decide to go for a global state, it's compatible with the use reducer hook. So you can dispatch actions just like you may have been familiar with in Redux, and then use that to determine some state changes. Okay, so next up, we're going to go into a little bit of a demo. I have a small demo app I built, and this is going to show us how we can use two context stores and provide them to different sections of our app. So here's the demo application. The two pieces that are important is one, the header bar. You'll see that this says header, and there's a button that says login. When you click the login button, a user is loaded, and based on if a user is present or not, the button changes from login to logout. So click, 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 back and forth from header to bradgarropy and login to logout. And then the second part that we should be paying attention to, I'll refresh the page, is this toast notification in the bottom that disappears after 3 seconds. So right now, this header is just using local state to load in a user. And the notification is just hard-coded to show this message and nothing else. What we'd like to do is make a context for the user and a context for the notification so that any part of our application can send a notification through the notification context. And, other parts of the application can track what user is logged in, or if there's a user logged in at any time. So I'm going to pull up the code here and we'll start implementing this. Here's what it looks like first. We'll pay attention to the header component, where if you come down here, it has authentication buttons, and if there's a user, load the logout button, and if there is not a user, load the login button. These are just normal buttons that on click perform the on logout and on login actions. And you'll see here, we're using normal set state, so no context or anything, just a set state hook. And on login, we use the set user function from use state to create this hard-coded user Brad. And Brad is just stored in this user.json file, just a hard-coded user that gets loaded up. But you could think of this login function to go hit Firebase or something, hand you back a user object, and you could load that into state. But this state is only local to this header component. Let's make this something more useful and put this into a context, so that way it can be shared with other parts of the application. The way I like to do this is create a new folder called context. And in there, let's make a user.js file. Let's import React. And let's import create context from React. This is the method that we'll use to create our context. So let's make a user context. Now we have a completely uninitialized context object. And we'll export this. Now, right now, this is pointless. This context does nothing. Not until you give a provider. And what I like to do, if we go back to the slides, In this example, I'm defining the value of the provider inline. And typically you don't want to do that. Your value might be tons of stuff, different functions, different variables, and it might get long and hairy. So what I like to do is create a custom provider component that handles all this heavy lifting for us. So let's do that. We'll make just a React component and call it user provider. And what this is going to do is return the user context dot provider, just like in our example, with some value. And we'll get to what that value is later. And this is going to wrap any children that are underneath it. So we'll destructure props, grab children out, and let's go ahead and make some prop types. And we'll define prop types of the user provider as children, which is a node, and it's optional. Okay, so right now our user provider is doing exactly what this is doing, except for we're just abstracting away value. So what would the user state need? Well, it might need what is the current user, maybe a method for login. Whoops. And maybe a method for logout. So let's just define this stuff. We can say we'll use a hook to have user and set user here, and we'll use the use state hook. So now user and set user are just part of this user provider state, which is wrapping, which will wrap parts of our application that need it. And then let's define two functions, login and logout. And right now, let's just do a console log for login and logout. And ultimately, that's what we'll be passing into value. Value is an object or a state that will be passed into any consumer that pulls in the context. So we'll just say const, I like to call this context, is equal to some object, which has the user, set user, login, and logout. And we'll just pass in context here. So to reiterate, all we're doing is making our own custom component called user provider that takes this context value and provides it to any children underneath it. What's in the context? Well, for a user context, we'll need who is logged in, how to change that, a login and a logout. And actually, let's just go ahead and implement these methods. Okay, when somebody runs the logout method, what happens? You want to set user to nothing. And when somebody runs the login method, you want to set user to, how about the hard-coded user Brad? And we had that imported from, oh, I can't remember. User.json. Cool. Yeah, think that's how we did it. Import Brad from user.json. So now on login, that's just going to take that user object and call set user with it, setting the local user state to Brad. So now we have a provider, and this is half of the story. Next up, we need our consumer. Well, we actually have to put the provider inside of our application somewhere. So we'll go to layout. We'll import our provider. Oh, and we forgot to export it. Let's go back here. We only exported the context. We also need to export the user provider. Okay, so back in our layout, let's import user provider. And we need to wrap our application in this, or only the parts of our application that need the user. Context, user. So right now, the only component that's using the user context is the header. So let's just wrap the header in it. And let's go to our app. Reload it. Can't resolve user.json. Whoops, probably did the path wrong. So we are here. We need to go up to the components directory, up to the source directory. No, it should only be one level up. Let's reload. Okay, great. So now, if we look at React components, we should have in the header somewhere, header, we have a user provider. Cool. So that's being wrapped. So now let's go inside of the header and create a consumer. So in the header.js file, we'll use another hook called useContext. And this is how we pull in context. And in order to tell the hook what context to use, we need to actually import that context. So we need to import the user context from context/user. So this should be simple. This is just a call to the useContext hook, providing it the user context. And what we get back is some kind of context. And let's log this out to see what it is. What you would expect is that it's just the value that we've provided with the provider. And the value is set to this variable called context. So we should have user, login, and logout. So let's reload this page, go to console, and this is what we have: a user object that's undefined, a login function, and logout function. So let's do something with this. Over in header, instead of using useState, we'll get rid of that useState. We'll destructure this context into user, login, and logout. And on login, what should we call? Login. And on logout, what should we call? Logout. And user is here, which is now provided by context. Anytime the context changes, any of these values inside of the context. Any component that depends on it will re-render. So this should update dynamically. When user changes, it'll either show header or first name or last name. So let's give this a test. We should have the same functionality as last time, but instead of using local state to the header component, we're using a context. Log in, log out. Log in, log out. Looks like it's working. We have double console logs because I logged in both the user context and in the header. Okay, great. So that's taken care of. Now, the next piece we want to do is to handle this notification. We want this notification to be able to be updated by any component in the application. Let's say some component triggers an action and we want to tell the user that it completed. We need any component to be able to send a notification. So let's move on over and create a notification context. Head back to our context folder, make a new file, call it notification.js, and we'll do the same thing here. We'll import React from React, and let's import create context from React, and we will create a notification context and export that context. Same pattern as the previous user context. And let's make our custom notification provider component. We'll destructure props and grab children. And we'll just return the notification context dot provider and wrap any children in that. Make sure to export our notification provider and define children and props. Not to mention import our prop types, which would be a node. Okay, now the next step is to determine what value are we providing to the wrapped components. So let's think about a toast notification. What do we need to be able to do? Essentially, all we want to be able to do is send it a message, essentially set the notification, and it can clear itself. So let's say some login action happens. We just need to say, hey, user logged in, and show that toast message. And then that component will take care of getting rid of itself. So to me, that just sounds like a use state hook, where you have a notification and a set notification. And let's import that, use state. And so what we essentially need to provide in the context is both of these values. Or sorry, one value, notification, and the set notification. So one value and one method will be passed down to all the children. So let's see. Let's start by wrapping the header. Well, actually, let's start by looking at the notification component and how it works. What it does currently is use a very similar use state hook to set a default notification of hey there. And after 3 seconds, we call, this is a use effect hook. So after 3 seconds, we say, hey, clear that notification. What it renders is if there's no notification, it renders nothing at all. And if there is a notification, we just render a little div with the notification in it. And what we also want to do for this application is anytime a user logs in and logs out, let's show a toast message that says like hi and bye. So what this means is that not only does the notification component need access to the notification context, so does the header component, because the header is where login and logout occurs. So let's go back to notification context. We are exporting the provider. Good. And at this point, when we have multiple contexts, I like to do something interesting. I'll make an index.js file. And I will do something like this. Export everything from user and export everything from notification. And I'll show you what this saves us from doing. Over here in layout, when we need to import our notification provider, we would have to do something like this. Because it's in a separate file, I'd have to explicitly call it out. And that's no good. Now, when I use an index file, I can just tack on notification provider and drop the file name. And everything is just coming out of context because it's going to look at index.js first. So where did we say we need this notification provider? We definitely needed it around the header. But we also said we needed it around the notification component down here. So this has to wrap both things. So everything in this subtree will have access to the notification context if need be. But you'll notice that this is nice. Even though this is a little bit more global than user provider, we can actually choose the scope of where our state applies. So if you have a more localized state management that you need to do, like let's say a multi-part form, you can do that. Restrict that state management only to that form and not to the entire application. You know, it just doesn't make sense. You got a couple of step form and you're holding that state at globally where any component can access it. So now we got our provider in there and we can start wiring up the notification component and the header to use that context. So in the header, we can get rid of use state and user.json because we're not using them. Let's pull in the notification context as well. And again, because of our index.js file there, it's as easy as just destructuring each context that we need. So let's do the same thing. We'll use context for notification context. And out of that came what? Notification, and set notification. So in this case, we only need a set. Because what we want to do is on login and log out, we want to do set notification to something. So let's do hey there with a little wave. On login and then log out. Let's say like goodbye. And then have like a sad face. Now let's see if this works. We'll refresh the page. We still have a hey there. because that's what the notification component is using. And no, this doesn't work. Well, why not? If we go check the notification component, it's still hard-coded to using its own local state. We need to wire this up to context as well so that the header component is firing up and changing the context of the notification. And then the notification component is pulling down that context and reading the same thing. And anytime the context changes, anybody who is wrapped in that provider will dynamically update. So let's import our notification context here. And we'll use instead of use state, we'll do a use context hook to grab that context. And out of that context, we'll need the notification and the set notification. We'll need the notification to determine what to display and set notification to clear after 3 seconds. So this essentially stays the same. Clearing after 3 seconds is all good. And actually, we don't really have to change anything from notification either. We just took the state and moved it out of this component, the exact same use state call, and moved it up into the context, therefore providing access to multiple components. So now, on header changes, we should be able to trigger the notification. So look, when I refresh, nothing is there because initially notification is nothing. We provide no default argument to use state. If we wanted to say like blah, 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 notification would start off as blah, 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 and then clear itself. But we want nothing there initially until something tells it, hey, I have a toast message for you to display. So let's do a login, and we should see our hey there message. Look, there it is. After 3 seconds, it drops off. And now on log out, we see our goodbye with a sad face. So let's take a step back here and try to figure out what we did. Let's look at our application and see if it makes sense. So here's our layout. Here we have a context provider only wrapping a single component. This is great because this context is localized. This state is localized to only the subtree that requires it. With Redux, imagine you would have to place this user provider at the very, very top and surround your entire app with it. And then notification provider, same thing. It only wraps the components that need to know about it. And I view this as very simple because the only complexity really is in setting up the context, what it is that you pass down to the things underneath it. And remember, this notification provider is just a component. It can have its own state, and that's where it holds the data for context. You don't have to try to store this in local storage or something. This component just holds its own state, and then any child can subscribe to that state. So that's pretty much the end of the demo. Just to review, I really, really like context, and I've used it actually in a full e-commerce website to manage what users logged in, the contents of the shopping cart, the product info on a given page. It works really well for me. I've never built an app big enough to require Redux, and if I did, I might just go with a single context and have a use reducer on there to dispatch actions. So really like this pattern. I think it's easy and has a very easy mental model to get around. So I don't see any questions in the chat. If you guys like this, you can find me online and see more of my content. I have a website where I blog. You can hit me up in email if you have any questions. I have, all the other social links: GitHub, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Here on YouTube, I live stream a couple times a week. Twitter, talk mostly about coding. So yeah, look online, find me there. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.